Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for bearing with us, and apologies for the delay in getting started this morning. We're delighted to see you all here. Before we have the official welcome, a few little bits of housekeeping before we get started. So the exit in the event of any emergency is over here to my right, and also through the doors that you arrived here this morning. There will be tea and coffee at 11 o'clock and lunch then at 1 o'clock at the end. As you may have noticed, there's a number of cameras there behind you, so we're filming the talks today to make them available on our website. So keep it clean, people, keep it clean. The final and really one of the most important pieces of notifications I have for you this morning is these things. Fabulous as they are, can I ask you to take a moment to take it out of your bag or your pocket, have a little check. Make sure either the sound is switched off or you have the mobile phone switched off altogether for us. And I'm actually going to do it myself now before I forget. Right, without any further delays, I'd like to invite the Chair of the Decade of Centenaries Commemoration Committee for Waterford City and County Council, Michael Farrell, to give us the official welcome this morning.
Thanks, Joanne. I'm very honoured to be here today on behalf of the Waterford City and County Mayor to welcome you all to what I'm sure will be a fascinating morning of talks. 100 years ago this month, Waterford was in an incendiary state with a bitter and often violent battle about to explode between farm labourers, farmers and the state. In May 1923, the farm labourers starting in the east of the county went out on strike in a rejection of the offer by the Waterford Farmers Union of 30 shillings a week for a 6-day week. This was a reduction of 8 shillings in pay and an increase of the working week from 45 hours to 54 hours. Dockers and other workers came out and supported the striking labourers, and here in Dungarvan, the SS Lady Bella and the SS Cargan were loaded and unloaded by farmers themselves as the labourers and dockers refused to handle their goods. Every family in Waterford City and County was affected. Striking workers and their families were existing on strike pay, and the strike affected many local businesses. The strike continued with increasing ferocity until December 1923, when the ITGW had to put a stop to strike pay, forcing striking workers to return to work or starve. Those seen as ringleaders in their area were not allowed to return to work and were forced to immigrate. This story of the farmers' labour strike and its impact on the people of Waterford is what we are here to commemorate today. We are grateful to the Department of Tourism, Culture, Arts, Gaeltacht, Sport and Media for funding this event and for their ongoing support for events for the Decade of Centenaries, 1912 to 1923. I would like to thank our speakers, Emmet O'Connor, Pat McCarthy, Terry Dunn and Kieran Allen for joining us today, and I look forward to learning more from them about the farmer labour strike and the impact that it had not just here in Waterford but in the development of the new Free State. Go raibh míle maith agaibh.
So to start our talks today, we are incredibly honoured to be joined by Emmet O'Connor. In speaking about this period and the Waterford labour strike, you really cannot have a better speaker or somebody who is more informed about this period of time and who's written more extensively on it. Emmet lectures in the Department of History at Ulster University. He's the honorary president of the Irish Labour History Society. He's published widely on labour history. In fact, he's the author in terms of labour history, and I couldn't recommend more his books: Reds in the Green, Ireland, Russia and the Communist Internationals, 1919 to 1943, Big Jim Larkin, Hero or Wrecker, and Dairy Labour in the Age of Agitation. And of course, most recently, he's published a book on Jim Bard, who is central to events during the farm labour strike in Waterford in 1923. The title of Emmet's talk is Waterford 1923, The Wider Context. And so he's setting, he's our keynote speaker and is setting the context for the events here today, and we're delighted to welcome him. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. And first of all, I'd like to congratulate all those involved in organising this centenary, particularly the County Council, Waterford Trades Council, the Decade of Centenaries Committee, and others. If anyone wants to contact me about anything, you can best do it through email. But I first came across the 1923 strike talking to the late Brian O'Shea, later Labour TD. And at the time I was doing an MA on Waterford Labour, and said to him, why is Labour so weak in the county? And he said there was some kind of a big strike between the truce and the treaty, and Labour lost, and he thought that was the reason for it. So I'd never heard of this. Well, this was the late 1970s. So it was kind of within a generation. But I took myself off to that fount of wisdom, the Munster Express, and looked at old microfilms there, and was amazed at what was there on microfilm, particularly 1922 and 2023. And I said to Brian, where did all this militancy and radicalism come from? And he says, well, I don't know, but he says, there were coal boats that used to come into Donabratton from South Wales, and maybe that's where they got it from. Well, that was the kind of state of Labour history at the time. Labour history was Connolly and Larkin in 1913, 1916. It all took place between Liberty Hall and the GPO, and we didn't know there was anything else going on. So to have all this militancy and radicalism in a place like Waterford was just literally unbelievable. So I kind of started digging around and trying to come up with some answers. And why did it happen? Well, two reasons basically: the World War and revolution at home and abroad. The war brought economic change, and in particular a food shortage when the German submarine campaign began to bite in 1915, 1916 particularly. The government introduced compulsory tillage orders, obliging farmers to bring at least 10% of their land under the plough, and that was later increased to about 15%. And tillage being labour intensive, or more labour intensive anyway, it created the first labour shortage on the land in Ireland since the Napoleonic Wars. Generally, Britain's wars were good for the Irish economy. So it was boom time during the war on the home front. As Patrick Cavendish said, during the war, money grew on the tops of the bushes. So you had a big increase in profits, big increase in wages too, high inflation of course, but then it all came crashing down in 1920-21 with the slump. But the other factor was revolution. At home and abroad, you had the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, you had attempted communist revolutions in Germany, Hungary, northern Italy. You had, of course, a revolution in Ireland. It was a national revolution, but still a revolution is a revolution. It's going to disrupt old ways of doing things. And in many ways, Sinn Féin, demonstrated a sort of political lesson for Labour, in that it showed the state is not above politics. The state can be captured politically and can be transformed. So that was a salutary lesson. And there was also this feeling that, there was going to have to be some payback for Labour in the post-war settlement. And it came in Chapter 13 of the Treaty of Versailles, which set up the International Labour Organization, which was founded to try and promote basic standards of pay and conditions for workers throughout the world. And I included this slide because the guy there on the right is Edward Phelan, who's from Tramore, or was from Tramore. As a kind of neglected figure in sort of local kind of public history, but he was the second most important man in the ILO in the 1920s, sitting there with the director Albert Thomas, and Edward Phelan later on became director of the ILO in the 1940s and was instrumental in ensuring that the ILO survived. It was only part of the League of Nations, which survived into the United Nations. So he deserves, I think, more recognition in Waterford. Well, it's part of the kind of internationalisation of the impact of labour. But turning to agricultural labour, it was a declining proportion of the workforce, but there were still a lot of labourers around. At that time, according to the 1911 census, 900,000 wage workers in Ireland, 200,000 of these were farm labourers. And there were only 4 counties that had more than 2 labourers for every farmer, one of which was Waterford. So the kind of the impact of the labour shortages and so on was going to be felt most in the south and the east. So it's mainly Munster and Leinster, and of course that was really where labour started to organise and became most political. Now at this time, wages for labourers throughout Britain and Ireland were notoriously low, and there was a survey done by Arthur Wilson Fox for the Board of Trade. Britain was lagging behind in the creation of a welfare state in the early 1900s, certainly lagging behind, well behind Germany. But the Boer War really kind of showed up how unhealthy the working class were, because about 25% of recruits for the British Army at the time of the Boer War were rejected on grounds of being physically inadequate. So the government decided we're going to have to do something about this. So they commissioned the Board of Trade to start surveying working class conditions, how people were living, what they ate, what they were earning, and so on. And this report showed that wages for agricultural labourers in England, Ireland, Scotland, Wales were quite low, and lowest of all in Ireland. In fact, it was a mystery to those who compiled the report as to how Irish labourers survived. So by 1914, the rate in Waterford was about 11 shillings and sixpence, and I reckon you probably that was really the absolute minimum you needed to live on. If you were an urban labourer, you probably needed at least maybe 13 shillings to survive at that time. With rural labour, it's a bit easier maybe if you could grow your own food in part at least anyway. But that book by Seabohm Rowntree, How the Labourer Lives, that was became a famous book on conditions for agricultural labourers in England. And there's a quote there. The wages, and this is for England, the wage paid by farmers to agricultural labourers is in the vast majority of cases insufficient to maintain a family of average size in a state of merely physical efficiency. And it's estimated that families' diet had a protein deficiency of 24%, rising to 35% for families of outdoor men. That'd be those who weren't indoor servants. So, bear in mind that labourers' wages in Ireland were much lower. And it's a famous quote from an English labourer's wife: "It's not so much a living, more a dragging yourself along." So, in looking at the intensity and the ferocity of the strikes in 1922-23, you've got to bear in mind that people are very conscious of the fact that if we lose this strike, we go back to the grinding poverty of 1914 and pre-World War I days. So that's why there was this element of desperation in the struggle. It wasn't like, if you're working in a factory, you lost a strike, maybe you took a hit and you kind of came back when there was a boom time, and a slump was always followed by a boom, just as a boom was always followed by a slump. But there was this kind of real consciousness, I think, among labourers in 1922-23. If we lose this, we're back to the poverty of pre-war days. So just to give you an outline view of Waterford agriculture, a total of 450,000 acres in the county. The acreage under crops rose from 80,000 to a peak of 97,000 because of the tillage orders. So, as I say, tillage being labour intensive, and the crops grown were mainly oats and hay. Waterford is a big dairy county, about 40,000 milch cows, and possibly that made farmers a bit more sensitive to their labourers, because you can't just get anyone to milk your cows. Cows need, people that they actually like and trust to milk them and get the maximum yield. So it may have delayed conflict in Waterford a little bit anyway. So it might also explain the kind of female component of agricultural labour, because manual labour for women on the land was really kind of dying out at this point. But there are references in the newspapers and so on in Waterford to the formation of what was called a women's battalion during the strike. obviously they took this from Russia. They took a lot of parlance from Russia. They're very much influenced by what happened in Russia in the Revolution and then in the Civil War. But they made this women's battalion may have been comprised of milkmaids who supported the labourers. But the union, the Irish Transport and General Workers Union, founded by Jim Larkin when he broke away from the Liverpool-based National Union of Dock Labourers in 1909. And of course it's identified most famously with the 1913 lockout, 1913-1914. The lockout was it's kind of turned into a moral victory by Larkin. He could do that kind of thing. But in material terms, it was a big blow to the union. Larkin went off to America in 1914. Connolly took over as acting General Secretary. Larkin remained the titular General Secretary because he planned to return to Ireland, wasn't sure when, but his intention was to go right round, as he put it, America, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and maybe eventually back to Ireland in his own good time. But by 1916, the union was down to about 5,000 members. It had peaked maybe at about 18,000, 20,000 maybe, just before the lockout. But then, largely because of the economic impact of the war, from early 1917, it starts to climb up again in terms of numbers and peaks in 1920 at 120,000 members. So that's a real mushroom growth from 5,000 to 120,000, less than 5 years. And branches are being formed all over the place. And formed so rapidly that you have a strong kind of rank and file consciousness, strong rank and file power. So it's more difficult for the union to control things from the centre because the union has grown so rapidly. And then about half of the membership are agricultural workers. So that's a very high proportion. And then if you look at the branches in Waterford, 10 in 1918, there would have been maybe 2 in the city. There was a branch in the cartridge factory, I think. And then you had a general workers branch in Waterford City. Then other branches springing up in the county, beginning here in Dungarvan. And by 1919 it's up to 19, and then by 1920 it peaks at about 24. Branches kind of roughly based on parishes, mainly in the east and the middle of the county. They're not so strong in the west. But the ITGW brings a new kind of professionalism to Irish labour. Now this is the union officers in Waterford City. They're here for the annual conference of the Irish Trade Union Congress, which met in the city in August 1918. And I think that would have been taken on the steps of what was the Imperial Hotel, now the Tower Hotel in Waterford. But this is remarkable. It's a remarkable kind of new having this kind of cadre of professional agitators, I suppose, as the employers would see them. Because before 1914, unions would have been confined mainly to craftsmen. Officials would have been largely part-timers. They'd been lay officials of the craft unions, because the craft unions could control membership through the apprenticeship system. And that was a more effective way of maintaining wages than strikes, because you could control the supply of labour through apprenticeships, and that was cheaper than strikes. But of course, for general unions, general workers, you didn't have an apprenticeship system. So how did you organise? How did you maintain the value of labour? Well, you could only do it through full-time union officials and then through militancy, if necessary. So this is quite phenomenal. There you see the guy in the white coat. There is William O'Brien, who was the acting General Secretary. On his right is the President of the Union, Thomas Foran. And on the far right there, you can see in the third row is Nicholas Phelan, who was from Kilmacthomas. And he was County Secretary of the ITGW in 1919. And for a short time he was a Labour TD. He was elected Labour TD in 1922. And he was expelled from the party in 23 for failure to attend meetings. I'm not quite sure why he didn't bother attending meetings of the party, but he just dropped out. And he lived on into the 1940s. But on the right there, just sort of straight across that line, is Thomas Dunn, who was a long-time branch secretary of the Waterford City branch. And this is James Baird. I think this photograph would have been taken around the time of his marriage, about 1898. But he was from South Tyrone, from Waterford in South Tyrone, and he became a branch secretary with the Boilermakers Union, very old, craft union in Britain. Everybody called each other a worthy brother in the Boilermakers and so on. So, but he was what was known as a rotten prod. Any Protestant who was not a unionist was called a rotten prod, and he was a home ruler, and because of that, and because he was a Labour activist, he was expelled from the shipyard in Belfast in July of 1920. And he organised there. He was elected a Labour councillor of Belfast Corporation, and eventually he got a job as an organiser for the ITTW in 1922, and ends up in Waterford 1923, leading the strike largely in Waterford. So this is Baird and his family, he had 6 children in 1922. Two of his daughters became very distinguished pianists in Australia, were decorated by the Australian government. After a strike, like so many other people, he just couldn't get a job, and the family emigrated to Brisbane, Australia. But the characteristics of unrest, it wasn't just in Waterford, it was right throughout the country, and it wasn't just strikes in the same way as we have strikes today. Even now when you've got a kind of a strike wave and so on. This was much more militant, much more radical, and it had this strong kind of political dimension, because people really believed they were on the verge of a new world, that the post-war world was going to be very different. And there was this kind of syndicalist influence within the trade union movement, this belief that you could transform industrial power into political power, and building up the union and taking militant action, you were laying the basis of what would ultimately become a workers' republic. And you create a workers' republic through the OBU. They borrowed this term from the American Wobblies, the syndicalists, the one big union, and the ITGW like to present itself as the one big union. So one of the features of industrial unrest was generalised action, which fitted in with this industrial unionist and syndicalist idea, organising on a class basis rather than a sectional basis. And there were also general strikes to do with politics. In 1918 there was a general strike against conscription. In 1919 there was a general strike for self-determination and international proletarian solidarity on the 1st of May in line with the directions of the Socialist International. And then you had a general strike for the release of political prisoners on a hunger strike in 1920. So Labour was very strong and well organised. And I believe the good times would just roll on, and when they were good and ready, they could transform this into political power. Another feature was the local general strike, and you had 18 of these at least in 14 towns, mainly in Munster, including here in Dungarvan. And they would kind of strike on a kind of a general basis, and sometimes the local trades council would act as a strike committee, and sometimes it would be referred to as the Soviet, because it's kind of a demonstration of workers' power. One way which they would kind of assert the authority of the union was through the pass system. This pass is from the 1923 strike, but they used a pass system as well in the general strike in Dungarvan in 1918. And it meant you could move goods with a pass from the union, but it also meant you accepted the authority of the union if you took a union pass. So you had farmers and employers getting union passes and implicitly accepting the authority of the union. Now, of course, the farmers organised as well. The Waterford Farmers Association formed in the courthouse February 1917. Quite a number of they tended to represent the better off farmers, and quite a number were justices of the peace, and they met in courthouses all over the place quite frequently. So then the Irish Farmers Union, the kind of national body, was also formed in 1917, and the Waterford Farmers Association in fact became a kind of section of the IFU. Initially the IFU kind of stressed it wasn't anti-labour. It said, well, Labour should organise too, nothing against that. But by late 1918, they were coming increasingly into conflict with Labour and becoming increasingly antagonistic They were formed genuinely to advance the interests of farmers, particularly related because of the increasing state intervention in agriculture with the tillage orders. The state was telling farmers what to produce and how many acres they could give to arable land, and introducing regulations for this, that and the other, and setting prices. So they felt we need to organise to deal with that. But increasingly they became, certainly by late 1918, a sort of an anti-labour body. And the big man locally was Sir John Keane, the baronet from near Cappoquin. And we see there Keane very much the country squire. This cartoon here, you can't see it clearly, but it shows a man painting out Southern Unionist Association and replacing with Irish Farmers Union, because quite a number of leading landowners who would have been unionists decided, well, home rule or some kind of self-determination is inevitable. We've got to make our peace with the new dispensation. We've got to, show that we're useful to the new country, the new society. And one way we can do it is by organising in the Irish Farmers Union. And Keane would have been typical of that kind of mentality. So wages, you see wages there. Kind of headline wages would have been for outdoor men 6 days, 12 shillings and sixpence, 1915 in Waterford, or 12 shillings and sixpence to 14 shillings. And then the Agricultural Wages Board, because it's getting so difficult to get labour, the government sets up the Agricultural Wages Board to introduce statutory minimum wages to keep labour on the land and compel farmers to pay. So initially the ITGW was all about enforcing the statutory minimum wage in the district, but after a while in certain areas it wants to go beyond that and try and make sure that, as they put it, the legal minimums do not become legal maximums. So initially the farmers accepted the AWB as necessary to improve labour supply. It's interesting, you get this mentality, we're not going to pay our labourers more wages, we're not giving them a wage increase, but we don't mind so much if the state does it, forces our hand as it were, if it helps to improve the labour supply. But by late 1918 the ITGW is trying to go beyond the AWB minimums and coming into conflict increasingly with the farmers. So the peak wages, 35 shillings for outdoor men in Waterford, that was agreed at a conference between the ITGW and the Waterford Farmers Association in the Granville Hotel in the city. They usually met there. So everything was going grand, but then along came the slump. It's a bit like 2009, if you remember 2009, everything was going grand in the spring, and then it all started to go pear-shaped, or was it 2008? I think it's 2008. It all started to go pear-shaped in the autumn, and pretty soon you're into a slump. Well, that's what happened. There was a crisis of oversupply. The war led to a huge increase in the world's productive capacity. By the autumn of 1920, too many goods on the market. So agricultural food prices are the first to fall. This leads to a general kind of recession in 1921 in Ireland and in Britain. In Britain, you have Black Friday, as it was called. The transport workers, the dockers and the railwaymen had formed this alliance, which the press called it the Triple Alliance. They promised if one union was attacked, the other two would come out in support. So these were three huge unions. But the mine owners were demanding a pay cut in April of 1921, and the National Union of Railwaymen and the National Transport Workers Federation decided they wouldn't back the miners, that the miners should accept a pay cut, which the miners didn't agree with. So that became known as Black Friday in Britain. It led to a huge reduction in pay rates right across the board in England, and there was an expectation that the same thing would happen in Ireland, beginning with the railwaymen in August of 1921. But events in Ireland were frustrated by the political instability and also by the militancy of the unions, particularly the Irish Transport and General Workers Union. So August 1921 to February 1922, you had a railway crisis, as it was known. You had a series of unofficial strikes on the railways and attempts to get reductions, and the railmen trying to push for opposition to the wage cuts, and eventually the union finally kind of caves in February 1922, and they accept the wage cuts So the farmers think, right, well, that's sorted out now, we can get on with cutting wages in other areas. But no, the Civil War intervenes, and by September 1922, the government's kind of got control of the territorial phase of the Civil War ended, and the Civil War kind of continued as a kind of guerrilla war. But the government now has largely control of the country, and they actually impose cuts in the post office. So you've got a postal strike. But again, the instability in the country and the militancy of the ITGW kind of delays wage cuts generally until the summer of 1923. So of course the Waterford strike kind of coincides with that. Now looking at the pattern of labour conflict on the land in Waterford, the first kind of serious strike started around the harvest of 1918. And the famous Fenner Malay, the biggest kind of single strike and conflict at the time, the farmers decided to bring in a harvesting machine, and the labourers mobilised against it, and it became celebrated in a ballad as the day that they stopped the machine on the road. So, as I say, peak wages are agreed in 1920, and things get by in 1921, but you have a county-wide strike then. Farmers make first big effort to introduce wage cuts in May of 1922, largely defeated in the east of the county, but in the west, where you've got the big landowners, the Ushers, the Musgraves, the Keens, they continue with the strike, and they're largely successful. And in the final phase then, I'm presuming the other speakers go into more detail, so I don't want to intrude on their time and their papers. But the final strike then, May of 1923, 1,500 labourers in 23 parishes, mainly east of Dungarvan. And the Waterford Farmers Association final offer was 30 shillings a week plus abolition of bonuses, which is a really sore point with the labourers because they look forward to their harvest bonuses. Privately, the ITGW was willing to go as low as 32 shillings, but only if they knew that the farmers would improve on their offer. And it was McAuliffe, the Department of Agriculture arbitrator, said that no, the farmers are not going to go beyond 30 shillings. So the ITGW then stuck to its position. But they reckoned that if they accepted less than 32 shillings, they really couldn't maintain credibility. There'd be really no point in joining a union that wouldn't get you more than 32 shillings a week. So that was the kind of thinking there, and why they had this as their kind of bedrock minimum. In terms of phases, the strike begins on the 16th of May. You have a phase of union aggression. The union had to win the strike in 2 weeks if it was to maintain its financial, to be kind of financially profitable for Waterford for that year. By June they realised that they weren't going to win, and they started searching for a compromise, but the farmers wouldn't agree. There's just details on the actual agreements were quite detailed, and the famous farmers' propaganda leaflet, "Thou shalt not steal" there. Famously, as Pat will tell us, they brought in the Special Infantry Corps. This is a great picture of the Special Infantry Corps guarding farmers as they make a mehel and engage in some harvesting. I wondered to what extent the strike was a kind of conflict between Keane and Baird. The only thing the two men had in common is that they both grew up on the banks of the Blackwater. Keane, the Munster Blackwater, and Baird, the Ulster Blackwater. Otherwise, they were quite different, except they were both Protestants. And interestingly, that wasn't mentioned at all. There's a lot of talk about the position of Protestants in Ireland by that time, but nobody mentions this in Waterford. Quite rightly, of course, but it's just worth remarking on that. Keane would have been Church of Ireland, and Baird was an Ulster Presbyterian. But I think Baird was certainly very militant, and he was later, in the autumn, he was arrested for advocating incendiarism, and he's supposed to have made a speech at Trevor where he says, we don't have any comforts, we don't have any weapons. We took a box of matches out of his pocket, and he says, we have these. That's what they said anyway. Finally, could the strike have been won? Well, not in Waterford, clearly not. I mean, the union really tried everything by way of hardline tactics and by way of seeking compromise. The farmers just determined to crush the union and have done with it. Keane was very much aware of the wider context, and he acted as a kind of brake on the farmers. He said, look, don't push ahead with militancy now before the government is ready. We need the support of the government to win the strike. So we've got to stay our hand if necessary. But with the support of the government, we can win. So he knew they needed the backing of people like the Army and Special Infantry Corps and the government. And of course, he wanted the government to kind of shift its whole. This would be kind of a test case for the government's whole policy in agriculture. And there were efforts by Labour to influence the state's agricultural policy through direct action in controlling food prices and banning food exports and so on in 1920-21. And Keane was totally against that, and he advocated the creation of the Farmers' Militia, the Farmers' Freedom Force, to stop that kind of thing. So he said, look, we want to get Labour out of agriculture, we want to get Labour out of state policy, we want to direct the future of Irish state policy. And he knew that the stakes were very high, not just about wages and conditions in Waterford. Could a general strike have succeeded? Baird put pressure on Foran to call a general strike, but were other workers going to come out just for Waterford? An across-the-board settlement, I think, was a possibility, which Labour did try to get. They asked Cosgrave for this. The problem was that the unions were too divided to put united pressure on the government, and the Labour Party was not willing to put itself on the line politically. Labour was at this time the official opposition in Dáil Éireann because Republicans were abstaining. So Labour had this kind of opportunity to say, look, to the government, look, unless you compromise with us on the industrial front, we're going to walk out of Dáil Éireann and jeopardise the whole future of the constitution of the Free State. But Tom Johnson, the Labour Party leader, wouldn't do that. He said, look, Labour is essential to democracy, to the continuance and maintenance of the Free State, so we're going to stick in it. And I think Labour paid a price politically for that. They should have been willing to do something against the intervention of the army and strikes. They're willing to make a protest against breaches of civil liberties and the treatment of Republican prisoners and so on. They should have done a lot more for their own people. So I think that the party suffered in consequence of that politically. So I'll just leave it there. I hope that kind of gives you an idea of the kind of general context, and thank you all very much.